Good afternoon and good day, depending on where you are. Thank you all for joining. My name is Khalid Latif, and I am the Executive Director at the Center of Pakistan and International Relations, COPER, and the Program Director, Middle East at COPER. Over the past few weeks, we have all been focused over the rapidly unfolding developments coming out from Afghanistan, which may have taken many by surprise, and also asking the existential question if Afghanistan does mark the end of the American empire, and has the American appetite for entering into conflict to preserve global dominance seems to be abating. The United States has the world's biggest economy, strongest military, and most influential culture. It's the only power with a global project defended and supported by more aircraft carriers, Fortune 500 companies, and more successful mediatainment conglomerates than any other. American power is felt in every corner of the globe. Its military spending equals to the rest of the world. America's post-Cold War optimism following the collapse of the Soviet Union has given way to pessimism, forecasting a declining power and, more crucially, the end of an American era, the rise of new regional and global powers, coupled with Washington's recent Afghanistan withdrawal and financial crises, have worsened the outlook for America's future. Has Washington finally overreached with its debt skyrocketing, its infrastructure crumbling, and its competitors vying for influence for the world is undergoing a profound and complicated transformation? Is all the talk of American decline premature? Is the sun finally setting on the American century? Countless books have been written to illustrate this persistent decline, with titles such as Suicide of a Superpower, The Empire Has No Clothes, Taming American Power, Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, Selling Out a Superpower, and In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of US Global Power. So is all this talk of a US decline premature? And if not, what role will the US play in a post-US century? And how serious are the doomsday scenarios? Is this decline temporary or reversible? And what does it mean to America and the rest of the world? That, of course, does not mean that the US has become irrelevant. Historically, empires in decline, like the Ottoman in the 19th century and the Russian in the late 19th and 20th century, have continued to wield imperial power and dominate world events. When I was asked to look into the event of whether or not the century of American dominance may well be coming to an end, none other than Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson immediately came to my mind, and I am so grateful to him for graciously accepting the invitation of COPER. Joining me to answer these questions and much more today at COPER, we are really pleased and honored to have Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson as the speaker to COPER's distinguished guest lecture series titled, Does Afghanistan Mark the End of the American Empire? Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson is the distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at William Mary, and if I'm not mistaken, it is the second oldest college in the United States. From 2002 to 2005, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson was Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He has a military career going back 30 years, during which time he was Associate Director of Policy Planning at the US State Department and Director of the Marine War College. In early 1989, he became the assistant to Colin Powell, whom he has come to refer to as the Black Eisenhower, and who was then finishing his stint as National Security Advisor in the Reagan administration. He continued this supporting role as Powell became chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff through the Gulf War, following Powell into civilian life and then back into public service when President George W. Bush appointed Powell Secretary of State. Wilkerson has been responsible for the review of information from the Central Intelligence Agency used to prepare Powell for his February 2003 presentation to the United Nations Security Council on Iraq. His failure to realize that the evidence was faulty has been attributed to the limited time, only 1 week, that he had to review the data. Since his retirement from the public sector, Wilkerson has on several occasions spoken out against what he perceived as the poor planning and execution of the Iraq War, as well as the global politics leading up to and following it. In particular, he has denounced the decision-making process of the Bush administration and Vice President Dick Cheney's and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's parts in it. Since the end of his military career, Wilson has criticized many aspects of the American national security state, as well as other aspects of American policy in the Middle East. Wilkerson has argued that the United States is in decline because of its own complicity, bad foreign policy decisions, and inept maneuvers in the world. For him, spending of 1.2 trillion on national security, instruments of hard power, and a pittance on state diplomacy is what in large parts makes the United States an imperial state. He says, what scares me the most about the empire is the disequilibrium of wealth. He has questioned how democracy can be maintained if 400 people in the US have a wealth that equals Brazil's gross domestic product. This problem of the empire's decline becomes compounded with the rise of other powers, i.e. the BRICS, for example. With this decline, Wilkerson explains some strategic ineptitude. In empire where the decision to go to war is made by Caesar and not necessarily debated by the Senate, danger arises when intelligence personnel make the executive want to do things they never thought of doing. This is a problem, Wilkerson has explained, when novices are in office, and the United States has not had an expert in office since Dwight D. Eisenhower. The below are the grim words of our distinguished speaker today. Quote, "We are imperial and we are in decline. America exists today to make war. How else do we interpret 19 straight years of war and no end in sight? It's part of who we are. It's part of what the American empire is. We are going to lie, cheat, and steal. We are going to cheat and steal to do whatever it is we have to do to continue this war complex. That's the truth of it, and that's the agony of it." End of quote. Colonel Wilkerson, welcome to Pakistan and to COPAIR electronically. The floor is yours. We look forward to both your address and your celebrated South Carolina accent. Welcome.
Khalid, thank you very much. I don't need to say anything. You've covered it all. If your distinguished panel and the listeners here have a chance and haven't already seen, I did an interview with Christiane Amanpour yesterday, which has gone out all over the world. And I think it's fair to say that I sort of even shocked her with some of the things I described, even though I only had about 15 or 20 minutes. But I recommend that interview to those who haven't seen it. In that, I tried to tell the audience some of the things that you just did more eloquently than I. focused, of course, on the reverie, if you will, around 9/11 and its 20th anniversary, and focused around Afghanistan and the ignominious retreat from Afghanistan. I think I shocked her most, though, by my recommendation for policy for the future. And it was exactly the opposite of what I think, as I said in the interview, we will pursue. What I think we will pursue is finding 10 or 12 or as many as we can lions of Panjshir or their equivalents, funding them and trying to overthrow the Taliban. What we should do, I said, was get with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, Wang Yi, the state counselor and foreign minister for China, and their equivalents in Iran, Turkey, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and most of all, Pakistan, and work out a modus vivendi whereby we can work together to do what we fail so miserably to do and what the Russians failed to do. That is to say, make a stable, reasonably forward-looking, prosperous Afghanistan. A huge task, even with diplomacy, finance, economics, and so forth being the principal tools. We've proven again and again that the military is not the instrument to do that. I think we have a different Taliban today. I think we have a Taliban leadership, the rank and file perhaps not so, but a Taliban leadership that is such that it can learn. It has learned. I'm not saying they're going to be Jeffersonian Democrats tomorrow morning, but I'm saying that we need to work with them and help them. Let me repeat, I don't think the empire will do that. That's not the empire's instincts. And I came to know those instincts viscerally. First, as a combat soldier in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970, and then as a practitioner of policymaking and strategy making for almost 20 years in the US military and then later in the State Department. And arguably working, as Khalid mentioned, for one of the prominent people in the US panoply of power, Colin Powell. In that, I learned what empire is all about up close and personal. Of course, I had studied Rome, I had studied Britain, I had studied a number of other empires. But most of all, what I came to study after my departure from the State Department with a lot of very brilliant students, over 400 of them, at two universities, the George Washington University and the College of William and Mary, as Khalid said, national security decision-making in the post-World War II era. That means from Truman on. And we looked at both clandestine operations, covert operations, if you will, and open warfare. We looked, for example, at the Harry Truman attempt to influence elections all across the globe in 1948 and 49 when we were trying to keep communists from being elected to governments. Italy comes to mind immediately in that regard. We also looked at the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala the next year in terms of covert operations. And we looked at overt operations like the Korean War and every war of consequence from there on. We looked at even President Obama and Libya. And let me just remark that I had the opportunity in the Roosevelt Room in the White House in the almost last year, the 7th plus year of Obama's 2 terms in office, to meet with the president and to talk with him, along with his Secretary of State, John Kerry. He stunned me. We were ostensibly there, General Paul Egan and myself and 1 or 2 others, to be thanked for our work on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement with Iran, which you will recall did not make it through our Congress, but by the slimmest margin, and was later negated by President Trump. But at that point, we were supposed to be thanked for that by the president. Instead, he gave us a disquisition, one that stunned me as a teacher of the very thing that he was going to tell us about. I never thought I would hear American presidents say it. His opening remark, and I quote it, was, "There is a bias in this town toward war." That was the President of the United States' opening remark. And the rest of his remarks convinced me, at least, that he didn't know what to do about it. That's a tragic situation. When a man is talented, educated, eloquent, and in some respects fairly brilliant, as President Obama, gains the presidency and then at the end of it makes a statement like that. On the one hand, I was surprised that he was that frank and that candid. I watched Secretary Kerry's face as he was saying it. Kerry was not happy that he said it. Kerry, at that time, you may recall, was advocating for U.S. ground troops in Syria. And President Obama was telling him in no uncertain terms, not on your life, Mr. Secretary, I will not do that. So it took him 7 years, but he figured it out. And he did a lot of damage in the interim, not least of which was Libya, for which I think he was feeling a great deal of remorse. That's the product that we produce today, though. And it's multifaceted. It's everything from Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Boeing and Raytheon and a host of defense contractors who have as much influence on the American government or more than the people, to big pharmacy, big fossil fuel like Exxon. Exxon has one of its greatest customers as the Department of Defense. In fact, if you put the Department of Defense on the list of countries in the world and their consumption of fossil fuels, it would be 55, right next to Portugal. So Exxon and the Department of Defense and other fossil fuel industry have a relationship that's significant and highly profitable. And there's so many other influences that are now making the national security state what it is, a war waging instrument. Now, the question you've asked is a very important one. And I gave a talk at Dartmouth not too long ago on the American empire and what needed to be done if it were to be saved, not as an imperial realm, but as a decent, God-fearing, if you will, practicing diplomacy, mostly power in the world, which I think was probably the conception that people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others at our founding had. They talked about empire too, but they talked about an empire of liberty, an empire of democracy, not an empire of aggrandizement, an empire of brutal power, an empire that said to everyone in the world, as Dick Cheney did, if you rise up and even look like you're threatening us, we will pound you with our military. We will pound you until you die. That was essentially the 2002, I guess we released it, national security strategy. That's essentially what it said, that if you threaten us in any way, we're going to get you, and we're going to get you with the military. That is an empire. We have 800 bases in the world now, 11 less because we left Afghanistan, which is good. Let's go down further. We have 800 outposts in the world where our military sits on a daily basis. The rest of the world combined, including Russia and China, has about 70. If that's not an empire, I don't know what is. But my talk at Dartmouth was primarily aimed at describing this briefly and then talking about finding an off-ramp, which is my dream, my desire before I pass from this world, which isn't going to be too much longer. We need to find an off-ramp. How do we find an off-ramp? Well, take a look at Britain. This was the empire on which the sun never set. In 1890, the United States economically and financially was replacing Britain. It took till 1956 and the Suez Crisis when Eisenhower essentially said to the Prime Minister in England, the President of France, and the Prime Minister of Israel, get out of Suez. Get out, or I'll make a run on the pound in the IMF. I'll do other things and you won't like it. This was to our former World War II allies. We essentially said, Eisenhower said, this isn't going to work anymore. And Britain really pulled in its empire. It had been doing that, of course, particularly after World War I and then again after World War II. But it began then to become, as Jeremy Greenstock said to me one day, a middling power. And I said back to Jeremy, you're not a middling power. You're still to be counted in the world, especially for your diplomacy, your economy, and so forth, your population in general. So we need to find an off-ramp to get to that kind of status. not necessarily like Britain, because Britain is not that populated. It's an island. It's surrounded by the ocean. It is next to that giant, now with about 700 million people in it, called the European Union. It has just exited that European Union. I think a tragic mistake, but it did so. So what would the United States look like? It's 340 million and growing people. It stretches 3,000 miles from the Pacific to the Atlantic. It has relatively benign neighbors on the north and the south. You're never going to put that in a middling power status. It's going to be a formidable power. But there are other formidable powers in the world too, not least of which is China. Russia still has 11 time zones last time I checked. We're trying to intrude on that very stupidly by moving right up to Russia's border. NATO now has 30 countries. It is a non-viable alliance. Imagine Americans being told they're going to risk nuclear war for Montenegro, or for that matter, for Latvia or Estonia, or for that matter, for Norway. Most Americans would say, are you crazy? There's no way I'm going to risk nuclear war for those countries. So NATO is moribund, even moribund increasingly as a political alliance, but we haven't admitted that yet. What do you do to replace that? And what do you do to replace all the other things that America has created post-World War II, but particularly in the last 20 years? The Levant, for example, where we're spread, like people say, well, we're focusing on China, we're focused on, that's hogwash. Look at the laydown of force and contractors to support that force from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia to Qatar, where the largest Air Force base in the world exists at Al Udeid, to everywhere else in the region, including now a base, a military base, something we said we would never do when I was in the military, in Israel. An actual US base in Israel. What does that mean? Hezbollah, you hit that base and you've attacked the United States of America or anyone else in the region. This is insanity. So we have to pull back. It's not isolationism in the words of the old scholars who studied that period between World War I and World War II. I don't think we've ever been isolationists. I think what we've done is retrench somewhat from time to time and pulled in our feelers, if you will, and not done some of the things in the world that were causing us enormous problems. Can we learn again from this latest experience of doing that on steroids? This last 20 years has been on steroids created by people like Dick Cheney and George W. Bush. I don't know the answer to that question. I do not know. I hope we can. I hope we can return to a world of diplomatic exchange, a world of finance and economics and commerce in general, a world where the seas are free for everyone's commerce and you don't necessarily have to ply them 24/7 in order to ensure they are. A world where China, Russia, India, the United States, and others, and I'm going to throw Iran in there, the true hegemon, if you will, in the Persian Gulf region, with all the people it has, almost 80 million, its geography and so forth. We recognized that hegemony when the Shah was in charge and working for us. Now we seem to have an impossible task just to have decent conversation with Tehran. We need to do that. And we need to become more diplomatically oriented, more commerce oriented, more economically and financially focused on other people as well as ourselves. And we need to do something else that might just be existential. It has two parts. We need, once again, to stop this talk I'm hearing from all over the world in terms of military talk, that nuclear weapons have found a use again, a utility again, that you can make small nuclear weapons, which the Russians are doing and we're doing, and that you can use them on the battlefield. This is utter nonsense. This is global threatening. This is life-threatening. And then the second aspect is climate and the crisis the climate is creating. If we don't climb down from our imperial stance and join with the world, first in forming really good arms control agreements that will curb this newfound utility for nuclear weapons, and put them back where they belong, in the closet, never to be taken out and never to be used. I don't think we can disinvent them, as my boss said one time, Colin Powell, because they're there. And as long as the technology is there, someone will have them. So I don't think we can disinvent them, but we can limit them, and limit them significantly from where they are right now, and have arms control that works. The second thing, the climate crisis is more difficult, I think, and more challenging. I belong to a group here in Washington. It's mostly, this will surprise you, it's mostly Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security, because the military recognizes the climate crisis as number one on its threat list in the future. It recognizes now drought and sea level rise as a component of that threat that it is going to have to deal with. We lost, in one hurricane, we lost a $4 billion Air Force base in Florida. And now, to show you how idiotic our politicians are, they demanded that the Air Force build it back, gave them the money in the same place, which is ludicrous, because the next hurricane on that trajectory is going to do it again. So we have to get out of this ludicrous mindset of ignoring what's happening. We have fires out west, we have floods, we have people dying in New York City in basement apartments. This is all going to get worse. We know it's going to get worse. The military knows it's going to get worse, and the military knows it's going to be called on to deal with these things, and not just domestically, but globally, because our power projection capability, we saw it in the tsunami in Indonesia when 230,000 people died. Colin Powell went out there and came back from that and said he'd seen the aftermath of nuclear war when he went to Aceh province, and he saw how devastated that province was. This is the future. If we don't get busy and act, and we can't act singularly, we have to act together. China has to act, we have to act, Europe has to act, Pakistan has to act, everyone has to act in this regard. So those threats are going to either cause the world to come together in a way it has never done before, cooperative, collegial, and working together, or we're going to disappear. The planet is not going to care. The planet did not give a hoot when the dinosaurs disappeared. It went right on, and it probably will go on for another 4 billion years until it burns out and is gone. We will be gone, though, if we don't do something about it. So these are the serious things that we need to downsize and get the empire under control for in order to deal with. Not to become a middling power, but to become a power that understands how to use that power in the world in a humane way, a way that President Biden has exemplified when he says, and I hope he means it, that we should do what we do by the power of our example, not the power of our armed forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Lawrence. Before I continue into my question session, I would like to ask you how your worldview has changed into becoming a vocal critic of US foreign policy, endless wars that serve the US military-industrial complex. Why has Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson decided to answer the call? To what extent are the views you're espousing the views either of the leadership of the US military and even the foreign policy complex in private? Because certainly in a public way, there's no expression of this among US politicians.
A very long, convoluted, complex, and difficult process. I'm a slow learner. It actually started at the U.S. Naval War College, which when I went there for 9 months was the premier institution of education in America, in my view. It started with my understanding of how strategy and policy went together in the American empire. And it started with I was very fortunate, some really good professors who allowed me to do what I wanted to do in terms of analysis and case studies and so forth, under their wise mentoring, and to come to an understanding of just how nations deal with one another in the world. I remember Fred Hartman's book, The Relations of Nations, which was quite a text at the time. And then it really, with a great deal of fortune for me, mixed with the real world, because all of my jobs in the military from then on were with 4-star admirals or generals for whom I became a policy maker, a strategy maker in terms of giving advice. Then I joined Colin Powell. He'd just come from being National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan, as was pointed out. As brilliant a man in terms of tactics and bureaucratic warfare inside this labyrinth of our government as I've ever met. But he had one singular deficiency in my view, and that was he didn't think strategically often enough. He was a New Yorker. He was looking for the man behind the wall in the shadows who's going to come out and stick a knife in his back, like all New Yorkers. So he's a brilliant tactician. So I thought together we'd make a pretty good pair. As I watched what happened in the Bush administration in particular, I was really appalled at a number of things. One, how inexperienced and utterly inept the president of the United States was when it came to confronting domestic and foreign issues, with the exception of a couple of things which grew out of his Christianity. And that was the HIV/AIDS fund, both globally and domestically. He really, really went after that and plussed it up. Africa, for example, finds him when he visits a man to cheer these days. And some other things he did were positive, but he did them mostly on the advice of Colin Powell. What he didn't do on the advice of Colin Powell really turned sour, badly sour. The one example that he showed us that was based on an entirely different comprehension than what I might want to say was China. You may recall that an EP-3 reconnaissance plane, US, collided with a Chinese F-8 fighter plane in the South China Sea in April of 2001. And Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld wanted that to be the beginning of a Cold War with China and did everything they possibly could to exacerbate that crisis. Powell took it over, got with Chen Shih-chen in China, and before we knew it, the crisis was over. But why did he do that? He did that because President Bush was on his side and supported him, because President Bush understood the importance of China to America's economy, and he wasn't about to start a war with China. But look at what happened when President Trump came in. President Trump took the exact opposite approach, and now we aren't even hardly talking to Beijing or Beijing to us, and I don't blame them. So I watched this go on, and I said to myself, newly educated, if you will, in how things should be done, isn't this incredible that the most powerful country on the face of the earth is being led by such idiots? And the decisions being made by these idiots are eroding that power dramatically. That changed my mind entirely about what I needed to be saying and doing, as little as it might impact the real world. I had to change, and I did.
All right. Colonel Lawrence, if I may take this occasion and ask you two questions with reference to 9/11 and Afghanistan, because this was a period of time that you were in the professional side of things. And I did a previous webinar about 3 weeks ago with Milton Bearden, who was the former CIA chief station to Pakistan.
I know him.
Yes, yes. And I asked him about Osama bin Laden, and he had a very interesting reply, and I wanted to know whether you agree with him. And I will quote him verbatim because I don't want to say anything which he did not say. So he says, quote, "The backstory to Osama bin Laden ending up in Afghanistan is another interesting one. In 1991, he was kicked out of Saudi Arabia, so he went to Sudan. Sudan was under sanctions by the US and was a designated state sponsor of terrorism. The Sudanese were desperate to get out from the sanctions list. So I traveled to Sudan in October 1995 and told both President and the spiritual leader of Sudan, Hassan al-Tarbi, that if they wanted to improve their relations with the US, the first step would be to get rid of Osama bin Laden. The Sudanese came to us later and said, okay, we'll send him back to Saudi Arabia. But the Saudis said, no way, we have no interest in this guy coming back. The Sudanese then said, okay, we'll give him to you Americans. And we said, no, we have nothing at this point, and we could not convict him, so we don't want him. Then the Sudanese said that, okay, we'll keep him here and keep a tight leash on him. But we said, no, you got to get rid of him. Then they came back again and said, how about Osama bin Laden goes to Somalia, given that Osama bin Laden said that he would like to go to Somalia. And we said, no, he's not going to Somalia. The Sudanese then finally came to us and said, okay, how about Afghanistan? And we said, my God, that's a far away place. Let him go there. What kind of trouble can he get in there? And so Osama bin Laden moves to Afghanistan. That was before the Taliban came in. So the next thing we end up is with jets flying into the World Trade Center. And so at this point, the United States had to respond, and it had to go into Afghanistan with a major invasion. As I mentioned at the onset, the Taliban reached out to me and said, it doesn't have to be this way. You just come, get Osama bin Laden, and let's get rid of this issue. Now, we didn't have any interest in doing that because we wanted to go to war. So is this your reading also of the events leading up to 9/11 and how Osama bin Laden ended up in Afghanistan?
If you hadn't made those statements right at the close, about which I'm not quite sure, I agree with every word that Milt said. It's that simple. Now, the reason I say that about the closing is that I think there were people, starting with Zig Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, who very early on realized that if they could generate opposition to the Soviets in Afghanistan that was meaningful, it would rebound to US credit and US interest. And so we began at that time to recruit people to go against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And that's how we created the Mujahideen, who gave home to Al-Qaeda and the other Arabs with bin Laden. And that's how it got really started and became what Milt said, something we couldn't control, and came back at us. I remember vividly when I was in the government with General Powell, and we had a situation in Afghanistan where the professionals within the military and within the intelligence community were recommending that we take bin Laden out. And what we were being told at that time supported some of the things that Milt said. You're going to regret this. If you don't, you're going to regret this. But we didn't have any armed capability to do it from the air. We had Predators, but they were surveillance and intelligence drones. They were not armed. The CIA wanted to arm them. And there was a huge battle inside the government, a bureaucratic battle between the Air Force and the CIA. It resolved itself in not being able to arm Predator. Didn't do it. The Special Operations Forces were asked to do it on the ground, as they did later in Pakistan with bin Laden. They came up with such a labyrinth of reasons that they couldn't do it unless those reasons were accommodated, that President Clinton finally said, go away, go away. So we didn't do anything about it. So that's the reason I have a little bit of different information about that ending.
Okay. One other question, again, with reference to Milt. The very next day of 9/11, Milton, he gave an interview to Dan Rather, and in which he discussed the mythological Osama bin Laden. And when Dan Rather pressed Milton on whether the official narrative, US narrative on Osama bin Laden was accurate, then Milton had said, quote, "My gut tells me that I'm not going to go with the first answer that comes to mind. but there's quite possibility something else is out there. Experts will jump on you and say it's Osama bin Laden, that he is the only one that is capable of this type of coordinated attack. My answer to them is he is the only one you know that's capable of this kind of attack. This was a tremendously sophisticated operation against the United States, more sophisticated than anybody would ever ascribe to Osama bin Laden. I think we need to do a little homework. We need to appoint a team B that looks for somebody else. My question to you is that 20 years after, do you share Milton's view that we need to appoint a team B that looks for somebody else?
I am not going to say I don't, because I think he's onto something. I've thought that for a long time. While I don't want to downplay bin Laden and al-Qaeda's capacity, which from my briefings, and they were highly classified briefings, of course, was quite formidable. And then you have to add to that the utter incompetence of the United States, from the Federal Aviation Administration, which would not order the airlines to even put locks on their doors like the Israelis had done, because they didn't want the airlines to have to spend the money. The lobbying of the FAA by the airlines was just every day, 24/7. So we just were stupid and utterly incompetent. And so it wasn't all that sophisticated if you look at it from that perspective. But at the same time, I know there are other organizations out there, and I know the Saudis are out there. And I know there's a reason why. I feel I know anyway, I wish I could prove it, that when all airplanes were grounded totally, the Saudis got in theirs and flew out of the United States. And you may know that the Saudis have their airplanes worked on, maintained, cleaned, serviced, and everything else, not by Saudis, but by Europeans or by Americans, because they fear their own people blowing them up while they're in their airplanes. The Saudis are behind, in my view, the major efforts at perpetuating terrorism in the world. Now, when I say that, I wish I could say I knew the royals were involved. I knew which royals were involved. I don't think there's any question that Prince Bandar was involved in some way. I don't think there's any question that Prince Bandar started the civil war in Syria with his efforts to get Bashar al-Assad overthrown. Who's ever talked about that? So yes, I agree with Milt in a general way that there are other things that need looking into. Why don't we do that? Because we want to perpetuate the global war on terror, because it is such a cash cow, a producer of profits for those involved.
Well taken, well taken. Lawrence, the way you have in your opening remarks, you touched on this. I just wanted to further get your perspective on this. The way the US withdrew from Afghanistan was done has really caused concern, in particular to the transatlantic alliance. So how can the US try to minimize the damage from the withdrawal operation so far to Americans' alliances across the world? And how can the US most effectively restore its credibility? And in particular, what are the implications it will have on Article 5 of the NATO's founding treaty on collective defense?
That's a good question. I think I've given you some idea of what my answer might be by my previous remarks. The first thing we need to do is get the some 100-odd Americans who are still in Afghanistan out. And I'm told now almost 100,000 Afghans who were very loyal to the US administration, the ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, NATO, in Afghanistan for the entire period of our presence there. Get them out. We've got to do that in order not to renege on our promise to them that we would take care of them. That's got to be a first priority. Second priority should be, as I indicated before, and as I told Christian in the interview yesterday, we need to take an entirely different approach to the region. incorporating the Chinese, the Turks, the Iranians, all the interested powers, they should have an even more ingrained interest than we do. They live there, cheek and jowl in most cases. So we need to take their interest into consideration, and we need to all work together to try and, instead of ruining Afghanistan as we've done for the past 30 plus years, we need to try to fix it. And not in some Jeffersonian democratic way, but in a way that makes it stable, peaceful, and reasonably tolerant of women and women's education and things like that that are important, but also recognize that if they want to have Sharia law, that's fine, so long as it doesn't mean bringing women out in front of a tribunal and then stoning them afterwards because maybe they looked at a man the wrong way or whatever. I think that's the way to do it. That's the way. And that would have repercussions for NATO. Now, as I said, I think it's an unviable alliance now. You've got 30 countries, and no American is going, I don't think Americans are even going to support a decision to risk nuclear war for Norway. I said that to a Norwegian parliamentarian recently who gave me a cold call. He called me and asked me if I thought we would honor Article 5 if little green men started showing up all over Norway. And I said, no, I don't think we would. It was rather disquieting, I'm sure. At the same time, he explained to me what Norway is doing. And I think Finland and Sweden are doing this or contemplating it too. They've brought conscription back. They are now conscripting some of their soldiers and others. But there's a very interesting thing they've done. The conscripts do not have to go to NATO's wars in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Syria, or wherever. The conscripts only defend Norway or Finland or Sweden. That's an interesting distinction, which tells you everything. I don't think NATO is going to last much longer.
Okay. Some analysts are saying that the U.S. is, after Afghanistan withdraw, the U.S. is basically repositioning itself to confront China. And as you have quoted President Obama saying that there is a bias in this town towards war. What I don't understand is that if this be the case, why would the U.S., the empire, abandons the only strategic position and landscape of Afghanistan the U.S. has on China's westernmost flank?
That's an excellent question. And you may know that my views have been somewhat bifurcated with my usual progressive audience, because I have said there are reasons for us to stay in Afghanistan, just like the reasons we stayed in Korea after 1953 and we stayed in Japan and Germany after 1945. There are good, valid strategic reasons, that being one of them. At the same time, I applaud President Biden's decision to finally cut the cord to get out of Afghanistan, because it was a dramatic move that needed to be made. Incidentally, the military is not accepting that move very well. The military has already got its own stabbed in the back philosophy going. It's saying it was not a military defeat, it was a political defeat, which is a direct shot at the President of the United States. This is unconscionable as far as I'm concerned. And I hope the president behind the scenes is doing something about it with the military leadership. That said, your question is a valid question. If you really think you're going to confront China in, God forbid, a war, because the war will go nuclear. I played in almost every major war game the United States conducted based on Taiwan, based on some other scenario, and every time it went nuclear. And let me be very, very clear about that in military terms. What is going to happen if we go to war with China over Taiwan in particular, but the South China Sea, whatever, is we're going to attrit each other's air forces and navies. China will have very little air left. We will have a third to half of ours gone. Same with our navies. And then we're going to look at each other. And my Marines used to call it the shark and the elephant dilemma. We will not go ashore and they will not come to sea. And so what do? And every war game has verified this. We go to nuclear weapons. In most of those war games, the civilians, for example, in one of them, Dr. Perry, former Secretary of Defense, was playing the president. The civilians say, no, we're not going there. End of war game. Well, that's the reality of it. And if you want a nuclear exchange in the world, don't look at India and Pakistan so much as we look at the US going to war with China, because it will go nuclear.
Okay. Colonel Lawrence, if we can rewind to 1986 and the early 90s, but especially during the period of the Cold War, why Israel was considered such a strategic interest of the United States. I am familiar with your speech at the National Press Club, which you gave, where you said that Israel is not a strategic asset, it's a strategic liability. But for our audiences, if you can give a historical backdrop, and especially in the context of US domestic politics, often more influential on national security decision-making and even foreign policy decision-making than the US national interest. And this also ties in with what President Biden had said, that if there had not been an Israel, the United States would have invented one. I also remember reading that you stated once that you are more afraid of a theocracy in Jerusalem than in Tehran, and that your chief worry for the United States is that Israel will lead the US into a debacle.
That last comment you made has, of course, for me at least, only manifested itself of late with Bibi Netanyahu and with the alliance he made with the ultra-Orthodox in Tel Aviv and now Jerusalem, which is more and more directing Israeli policy, even with the current leadership. That worries me. It worries me far more than the very rational theocratic leadership in Tehran. I defy anyone to tell me that that leadership is not rational. Every decision they make, every move they make is based on Iranian national interest and the interest of the IRGC increasingly. And that interest is just like our interest many times, filthy lucre, money, because the IRGC is so heavily involved in everything commercial in Iran. That's really rational. It's corrupt, but it's really rational. So that's why I made that statement. I don't think that's the case in Israel, except with the secular Jews. With the religious Jews, it's all about religion. It's all about theocracy. And that scares me. That really frightens me, because that in the past has been, as everyone knows who studied warfare, a really bloody aspect of some of the worst wars we've ever had. The rest of it is more or less where Israel has come since 1948. As I pointed out in that speech, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and particularly General George Marshall, then of course a civilian, recommended to Truman that he not recognize Israel. And the reason they did that was because they saw what was coming. Marshall in particular was prescient about it. And if you read the Joint Staff analysis today, it reads like a forecast of the future. This is going to be a real problem. You have 22 Arab countries, you got about 400 million Arabs, and they're all going to hate your guts. And you're doing that all for this little enclave, much like Taiwan is at the north part of the South China Sea, in the Mediterranean. And by the way, you don't need that enclave anymore. And by the way, you don't need Taiwan either. It's the 23 million democratically motivated Taiwanese that you're really defending on Taiwan, not a military advantage. Because with B-2 bombers and nuclear weapons and so forth, you really don't need those kind of outposts anymore. The reason we have those kind of outposts is because they manufacture war for us. They manufacture more money for the complex. They manufacture the very essence of our empire, which is to be at war all the time. One reason why I'm in a group that's advocating closing at least 50 to 60% of those bases and doing it forthwith as fast as possible. Costs the American taxpayer 75 to 100 billion US dollars a year just to maintain those bases. And as I said, they are a war maker in and of themselves. Every person on every base in Africa, for example, is constantly looking around and saying, oh, I see a threat. I see Boko Haram here. I see this group in the Sahel. I see this, I see that. Let's get some people over here and let's take care of this threat. That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It's worse than when we said, oh, I see a communist behind every tree. Oh, we need money and we need soldiers. This is not a way to run an empire. So that's that. I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yes.
that's my feeling.
Okay, and if I can come back to the empire part, uh, is this American century, or however you want to call it, now in decline? Is there something happening or some set of structural things that are happening that qualify for such a phrase to be used? And if you think so, what are the signs of this dislocation to you that signify an empire in distress that's been essentially pillaged by a global capitalist elite? Do we have now a kind of classic collapsing empire ruling class that is so besotted with the accumulation of ever more that they've lost all sense of the reality around them, that if they are, I can borrow the old phrase, somehow busy killing the goose that laid the golden egg?
You need to come on this side of the camera and deliver the remarks. You give your own best answers. Lee Kuan Yew said before he died, I think if I remember right, I remember him saying this at a table at which I was sitting for dinner with George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, of all people. And Lee Kuan Yew was waxing eloquent, but I think he said it in a foreign affairs article too. He said, the 20th century was the American century. The 21st century will be the American century. In the last decade, I've come to doubt that. Otherwise, Lee Kuan Yew was a wise man. And for some of the reasons that you just said, but leading the pack, if you will, other than the warmongering, is this disparity of wealth. It is unbelievable that we have allowed the wealth disequilibrium in the United States to become worse than it has ever been in our history, worse than 1929, before the fall of the stock market and the Great Depression. It is not the top 10% I'm talking about. It's not even the top 1%. It's the top 0.001% who have more wealth than is imaginable in most Americans' imagination. And it's not being supportive of our principal concept post-World War II, and that is a viable, functioning, successful, relatively prosperous, democratic middle class. We no longer have that. We've murdered it, and we are murdering it every day, even worse. So if there was something I could do tomorrow morning to begin to correct the problems of the empire domestically, it would be to do something about that disequilibrium. Now, Biden's trying that, but he's not going far enough. Dwight Eisenhower had a tax, as was continued after World War II, on the wealthiest in the nation of 90%. 90%. They bridle now at a 2 or 3% increase. This is nonsense. 90% is where it should go back to those whom much is given, much is demanded. And we have so many billionaires now, we can't even count them anymore. We need to correct that situation, desperately so.
Okay. Two more questions, because I think we're on the edge of the time, and our closing remarks will be given by our chairman, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood. So I'm going to lump the two questions together, and then I'm going to follow up with a detailed email for you on certain other things which I wanted to get in touch, but given the time shortage, I'll just ask you on these two questions. You once said that the power of the US dollar and the US banking system, and you mentioned Charles de Gaulle, who once said that the most pernicious weapon America yields is the dollar of the power of the dollar. Can you elaborate on this process, one? And second is, I don't know, I'm sure that you must have read William Strauss and Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning, in which he refers to the cycles of history, and that America has entered its fourth turning, or the unraveling, to confront its next rendezvous with destiny. In your opinion, is this case of a fourth turning, or is it a case of a dying order, of a dysfunctional system, of a capitalist mode of production, and that the COVID pandemic has just accelerated this decline?
Let me take the last part of your question first, and I apologize for being so verbose. I've taken all the time. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think we're at a juncture where it's over in many respects, but no, because I think if it is, we're not going to meet the climate crisis adequately, successfully. That threatens all of humanity, not just the empire. So if we don't get our act together, and if the rest of the world doesn't help us get our act together, even pressure us to get our act together, one of the phenomena of history is balancing. When a hegemon gets too powerful and too ugly and too brutal, the rest of the world finally wakes up and balances it and takes care of it. Sometimes that can be quite bloody, but look at Rome and Hannibal, for example, 100 years before Rome finally got revenge, if you will, for Cannae and 70,000 dead Romans. So I think confronting this existential crisis that we all confront, that all of humanity confronts, is going to throw a wrinkle in this, I hope. And we're going to have to become a different country, and we're going to have to become a leader again, but a leader in a good sense. We're going to have to welcome China's leadership and France's leadership and all the rest of the world that has a dog in this fight, and that's the rest of the world, really. All of their cooperation, a confluence of interests, and joint action. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. And when I say we, I mean the human race. So it's a critical juncture that's not addressed in that theoretical exploration of what might happen in the fourth turning or whatever. This is a very different situation. It is arguably a unique situation in 5,000 years of human history. If we don't meet it properly, we could be ending that 5,000 years. And I don't buy this yet anyway. Maybe I will someday if I live long enough. Elon Musk idea of let's go to Mars. Let's re-engineer Mars. Let's somehow go to another galaxy. Let's live under the ocean or whatever, which is being experimented with right now by some of these billionaires because they are smart enough and have assets that advise them, that are telling them this might be the end. So they're looking at all kinds of alternatives to get out of this crisis other than mitigating the crisis, ameliorating the crisis. That's worrisome too. But I don't think it's the same as other cycles in history. I think it's very different for those reasons.
My apologies, Colonel Wilkerson. We just received one last question from an audience, so I thought that before I give the ambassador the closing remark, if you can briefly just answer this question. Quote, is the US going to do something to dethrone Taliban in Afghanistan?
I'm afraid so, but I hope not.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Colonel Lawrenson. Always a great pleasure and a learning curve for me to be listening to you.